when thousands of supporters of the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, stormed the country's Supreme Court, presidential palace, and Congress last Sunday, comparisons to the January 6th insurrection in the U.S. came fast and furious. With us now to explain how well those comparisons stand up to scrutiny and what fueled the violence in the first place, we're joined from Rio de Janeiro by Brazil News Director for the Associated Press, David Biller. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so there are a number of factors into sort of what happened, but explain to us, why did the insurrection happen?
Well, first of all, we had encampments of these pro-Bolsonaro supporters outside of army buildings in multiple cities, including in capital Brasilia. These are people who do not accept Jair Bolsonaro's loss and have been asking for the armed forces to intervene, asking for Bolsonaro, when he was still in power, to take action, and that didn't happen. Bolsonaro spent months sowing doubt about the reliability, about the electronic voting machines that the country uses and has used since 1996 without any evidence of fraud. He didn't present any fraud evidence as well. And so these people were led to believe that this election was fraudulent, even though there was no proof of that. They were waiting for some sort of move from the armed forces, from the president, and that didn't come. So on Sunday, thousands of them, not just who were there already camped out, but who also arrived on buses, went to protest, and what we saw was complete mayhem. Part of the reason that this appears to have happened is that the police force, the local police force, was either unprepared or may even have been colluding with these protesters. Investigations have just really started, and they're looking into whether the local security secretary had somehow facilitated the protesters' ability to access these top government buildings.
All right, as we know, last week was the anniversary of the attacks in the U.S. on the U.S. Capitol Hill on January 6th. A lot of parallels, of course, have been made. Let's talk about that. What parallels can be drawn between the insurrection in Brazil and what happened in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, like I said, the president spent months claiming that the voting system that Brazil uses was susceptible to fraud without providing any evidence to that effect. We saw the same thing in the U.S. These are also diehard supporters in a very polarized country. I think also like Trump, Bolsonaro was straining against other branches of government, other institutions, and so obviously that inflamed the tensions of the country that was already very, very strained. That's part of it. Although the thing is, Bolsonaro left before Lula's inauguration, 2 days before. This wasn't like Trump in Washington saying, let's march on the Capitol. It was Bolsonaro in Florida, actually, and he was posting photos, and his supporters were sort of trying to assess these photos for enigmatic clues, as though Bolsonaro was maybe guiding them from afar. But there was nothing really saying, you need to take action. I think that another thing that's worth highlighting is that there's a lot of overlap between the orbit of Jair Bolsonaro's family and that of Trump. You saw Eduardo Bolsonaro, his lawmaker son, has really built bridges with Steve Bannon and Jason Miller and Mike Lindell, these people who were around Donald Trump. And when the rioters were taking over the Capitol, Steve Bannon was sharing video and calling them freedom fighters. So these are two different scenarios, but there is overlap, and investigators are looking into whether there are in fact connections, direct influence.
I'm hoping you can give us a sense of what's happening on the grounds there. And I preface that with, should Brazilian authorities and are Brazilian authorities bracing themselves for more violent demonstrations?
They certainly are bracing themselves for more. The other day, we had a call for protest. It was called a mega protest to retake power that was supposedly going to occur in 24 cities. We had the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. He decreed that people could not occupy public buildings, could not block roads, and really ordered authorities from around the country to hold people responsible, to record license plates and identify people. And in the capital, we saw the man who has been tasked with shoring up security in the federal district. He created a designated area for protest and surrounded it by police and National Guard. But the result was a complete dud. There were 2 protesters in Brasilia, literally 2. In Rio de Janeiro, there were something like 10, and more journalists were covering it than protesters. We also had, Sao Paulo was completely empty. And so I think it really shows just how jumpy authorities are right now. They're very concerned that something else could happen, and they're not taking any chances. But what remains to be seen is whether these protesters are regrouping, whether they will try to stage other uprisings, whether in the capital or elsewhere.
I don't know if this has to do with it, but the Brazilian government has been praised sort of for its swift response and taking measures like declaring federal emergency, arresting more than 1,000 rioters. What's the sentiment on the ground there? Do Brazilians agree that Lula's administration handled the demonstrations well? And maybe that is perhaps the reason why, say, these later protests are quote-unquote duds.
What we've seen in the wake of this uprising is a sort of a rally around democracy led by Lula. He and the heads of other institutions, Supreme Court, Congress, and governors from all of Brazil's states are trying to show and forcefully show that they are on the side of democracy and they won't tolerate attempts to subvert it. So, at least first of all, from the authority level, there's a clear sign that there will be no tolerance for uprisings of this sort. Also, the authorities are pursuing not just legal action against the people who were detained and arrested physically in these spaces and at the encampment outside the Brasilia Army headquarters, but they're also going after the people who finance the transport of the protesters to the city, the people who may have enabled them to storm the buildings, the local security personnel who may have stood aside and let protesters pass. So it's a very forceful response from the authorities. And then from the average people, I think a lot of us here in Brazil, we were expecting this because, to some extent, because Bolsonaro had incited his protesters for so long or stoked, their discontent. And then we all sort of let our guard down a little bit after Lula was inaugurated. The scene that played out the week afterwards was shocking to people as a result. We were not prepared to see this. And a lot of people who were moderates or even some on the right do not feel that this represents them, and they've rejected this. And you've seen people, in the Bolsonaro camps, in fact, claiming falsely that this violence was perpetrated by, leftist infiltrators of their movement. But so you see a widespread rejection of what happened on Sunday.
All right, I want to return to Bolsonaro, as you mentioned, in Florida right now. It's sort of emerging as a potential diplomatic issue between Brazil and the U.S. Has the Brazilian government, to your knowledge, put in any requests to the American government to have him brought back or expelled from the country or returned to Brazil?
To my knowledge, no. The Justice Minister said the other day that they don't actually even have the technical ability to ask for extradition because there aren't, there is no criminal charge against Bolsonaro at this moment, and so doing that is not something that's within their powers. That said, there is an effort, first of all, on the part of U.S. lawmakers. Democratic lawmakers sent a letter to Biden. I think it was 46 of them, including Joaquin Castro, and I think the letter was led by 3 or 4 others, Gregory Meeks, and I can't remember who else, but urging Biden to review the visa status of Bolsonaro. They have not said, the State Department hasn't said what visa he entered with, but It's presumed he entered with an A1 visa, which is for sitting presidents. And when you're no longer in power, you have to revise your visa status within a month. And so these lawmakers are urging the Biden administration to assess his visa and and in the case that he's on an A1, which people presume to be the case, revoke that and force him out of the country. There's one other thing I would mention, which is that the security secretary for the federal district on the day of the riot was actually in Florida as well. He wasn't present. This is a man who was Bolsonaro's justice minister and has been, there are allegations that he facilitated this riot. He fired several subordinates and promptly left the country, which the federal appointee who's in charge of security now for the federal district has said amounts to sabotage. He is still in the U.S., and the justice minister just minutes ago said in a press conference that if he isn't back by Sunday, he will be considered a fugitive, and they will request his extradition. There's already an order for him to be placed under arrest.
David, thank you so much. Some really interesting stuff there. A story, of course, we will continue to follow.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.